Pharloom looks like a kingdom ruled by one god, but the deeper you descend into its history, the more that certainty starts to collapse. Only a small percentage of viewers are subscribed, so if you enjoy the video, hit the like button. It's free, and you can always change your mind. At first, the religious structure of Pharloom seems almost simple. There is a shining citadel above everything else. Pilgrims climb toward it. Bells and prayers fill the land, and silk runs through the kingdom, like the veins of some enormous living creature. Somewhere at the center of all of this is Grandmother Silk, the pale higher being whose influence reaches from the cradle into almost every corner of Pharloom. But Grandmother Silk is not the beginning of this world. She is not even the beginning of power in this world. And that detail changes almost everything. Silksong never officially presents a category called the Outer Gods. That name is useful because Pharloom contains several beings and forces that exist outside the religious system built around silk. Some are worshipped as gods, some are ancient creatures whose power appears comparable to divinity, some seem to represent the land itself, and one of them may not even be a living being in any normal sense. Together, they reveal something much larger than the story of Hornet fighting a single pale monarch. They reveal a world where gods arrive, kingdoms build themselves around them, religions attempt to control them, and eventually even those religions become ruins. To understand these powers, we first need to understand what being a god actually means in the world of Hollow Knight. The series has never treated divinity as a clean hierarchy. There is no simple ladder where ordinary bugs stand at the bottom. Kings stand above them, and gods occupy a clearly defined level at the top. Higher beings can possess extraordinary power, but powerful mortal creatures can also shape entire regions. Some divine beings create life. Others alter existing life. Some rule openly, while others barely seem interested in civilization at all. Worship matters, but worship alone does not make something divine. Age matters, but ancient things can still be mortal. Power matters, but even gods can be imprisoned, wounded, forgotten, or killed. This ambiguity is important because Pharloom is a kingdom obsessed with religion while simultaneously being filled with evidence that no single religion has ever completely explained the forces surrounding it. Grandmother Silk is the most obvious example. She is described as the primal source of silk and a pale higher being. At some point in Pharloom's distant past, she appeared in lands that were already inhabited. This was not an empty world waiting for a creator. Tribes, rulers, ecosystems, and cultures already existed before her arrival. That makes Grandmother Silk fundamentally different from the way her own mythology seems to present her. She did not create Pharloom. She conquered its story. The distinction matters. Among the creatures already living in the region were Pharlids, small arachnid creatures driven largely by instinct. Grandmother Silk used her power to transform some of them into the weavers. She elevated them into intelligent beings capable of producing silk and participating in the enormous system that would eventually dominate Pharloom. And then she gave them a history. She told the weavers that they were her daughters. She told them they were divine. This is one of the most important details in the entire mythology of Silksong because it shows Grandmother Silk doing more than creating servants. She is creating identity. The weavers are not merely altered creatures, they are given a sacred explanation for their own existence. Their biology, their society, and their relationship with their creator are all woven together into one story. That story is also a lie. Eventually, the weavers discover enough of the truth to rebel against their supposed mother. But their rebellion does not involve simply killing her. Perhaps they cannot. Perhaps the consequences would be too dangerous. Instead, they put her to sleep. The citadel becomes part palace, part religious institution, and part prison. Its songs and prayers help maintain the system that keeps Grandmother Silk dormant. Silk continues to be drawn from her. Her power remains useful even while her existence becomes something the rulers of Pharloom would rather conceal. This creates the central contradiction of the citadel. The holy structure at the top of the kingdom is not simply a temple built to worship a god. It is a machine built around containing one. Religion becomes infrastructure. Prayer becomes technology, song becomes a lock, and the god beneath the mythology becomes a captive resource. For a time, the arrangement works. But the weavers understand that their victory is temporary. Grandmother Silk remains the true source of the power running through their civilization. They create bindings and devices intended to secure their freedom, yet none of these solutions completely remove the danger. Eventually, many weavers leave. Others die. And the civilization that once imprisoned its god slowly loses the people who understood how the prison worked. Then the prisoner begins to move. The haunting is grandmother Silk reasserting herself through the very substance that Pharloom has spent generations depending upon. Silk is not simply thread. It connects living creatures to the being from which it originated. Grandmother Silk can reach through that connection, snaring bugs and bending them toward her will. The kingdom's greatest resource becomes the path through which its buried monarch returns. This is why the haunting feels less like a conventional disease and more like possession at the scale of a civilization. Grandmother Silk does not need to march an army through Pharloom. Pharloom already carries her inside itself. But there is another reason her story is so important when discussing Silksong's outer gods. She was an outsider once too. Long before the Citadel turned Grandmother Silk into the center of Pharloom's religious universe, she arrived in a land where other powers already existed. The snail shamans make this point clear when Hornet begins searching for the old hearts. Pharloom was not born from the Pale Monarch. There was strength in these lands before Silk bound them together, and some remnants of that older world still survive. One of the most fascinating is Nyleth. Nyleth does not resemble Grandmother Silk's model of divinity. Grandmother Silk arrives, transforms creatures, and builds a system of control around herself. Nyleth is closer to an ecosystem given consciousness. She is the ancient heart of Shellwood, the seed from which the region grew, and a being connected to the living things throughout it. Her presence once maintained the balance of the wood, creating a fragile order in which other creatures could survive and travel. If Grandmother Silk represents the god as monarch, Nyleth represents the god as environment, there is no need for an army of priests enforcing her authority. Her authority is expressed through life itself. Shellwood exists around her. The distinction becomes even more interesting when the Citadel encounters Nyleth. It does not simply destroy her. Instead, a reluctant arrangement is made. Servants are sent as a sign of respect. A shrine is constructed in her likeness. Think about what that implies. The civilization supposedly ruled by a dominant pale, higher being still has to negotiate with an older power rooted in the land. The Citadel can dominate much of Pharloom, but its control is not absolute. There are things it must acknowledge. Nyleth therefore gives us a glimpse of what Pharloom might have looked like before Silk created a single political and religious network across the region. Power may once have been local, tied to specific ecosystems, rulers, and ancient hearts, rather than concentrated at the peak of one kingdom. And Nyleth is not alone. The old hearts preserve traces of several powers that existed before Grandmother Silk's dominion fully consumed Pharloom. Not all of them were gods. That is precisely what makes them interesting. Skarsinger, Carmelita possessed a strength and voice capable of uniting wild tribes. Crust King Khan ruled through overwhelming martial force and could command the coral crust itself. The rulers of Verdania carried a different kind of authority, one built around lineage, myth, beauty, and a kingdom whose memory survives long after its destruction. These beings are described as mortal, yet their hearts contain power great enough to matter in a conflict involving a pale higher being. That tells us the boundary between mortal and divine is not the same as the boundary between weak and powerful. A god may possess qualities that mortals lack, but mortals in this world can still gather enough power to challenge forces far above ordinary life. The old hearts are evidence that Grandmother Silk did not conquer a helpless land. She conquered a land filled with competing forms of power, and once that conquest lasted long enough, the older powers faded. This is one of the darker ideas hidden underneath Pharloom's religious history. A god does not need to erase every rival physically. Sometimes it is enough to dominate the world for so long that every alternative becomes a ruin, a memory, or a relic. Nyleth becomes a preserved memory. Carmelita reaches the end of her strength. Khan's age becomes dust. Verdania survives as grief. Meanwhile, Silk remains everywhere. This is how one god can appear to have always ruled a kingdom that existed before she arrived, not by creating the past, but by outlasting those who remember it. Then there is the Father of the Flame. If Nyleth represents divinity rooted in nature, the Father of the Flame represents something much stranger, divinity created through worship, ritual, and transformation, deep within Wisp Thicket. The burning bugs worship a massive wooden figure described in language that blurs the difference between an idol and the thing it represents. It is both totem and god. At its center are the remains of an aged bug associated with ritual immolation. Around it is a culture that sees burning not merely as death but as liberation. The burning bugs do not fear the flame. They want to become part of it. Their prayers describe fire as something that builds and destroys, something capable of searing away the shell so that another form of existence can begin. Their final goal is not survival. it is union to meet the father, they burn. This makes the father of the flame difficult to classify. Was there always a supernatural being behind the religion? Did the burning bugs discover a force already present in Wisp Thicket? Did generations of ritual somehow create or embody their god? Or is the giant totem merely a physical focus for a power that exists somewhere beyond it? Silksong refuses to provide an easy answer. What it does show us is that the burning bugs can interact with wisps, strange creatures of living flame that respond to their practices. The thicket itself appears saturated with fiery activity. Their belief is connected to something real enough to produce consequences. And when Hornet destroys the father of the flame, the reaction of the cult is immediate and horrifying. The burning bugs immolate themselves. Their religion reaches its logical conclusion. This is where the idea of an outer god becomes useful. The Father exists outside the Citadel's theology. Its followers are not simply another branch of the dominant faith. They participate in a completely different spiritual system with a completely different understanding of salvation. Grandmother Silk promises unity through silk. The Father promises unity through fire. Both erase individuality in different ways. One binds, the other burns. And both reveal how often religion in Pharloom turns death into a doorway. For the followers of Grandmother Silk, surrendering the self means becoming part of an eternal collective held together by thread. For the burning bugs, surrendering the self means destroying the shell and rising through flame. The imagery is different. The desire is disturbingly similar to stop being separate, to become part of something larger. Then, high above almost everything, there is the Fayforn. The Fayforn may be the clearest example of a power that does not need a conventional religion at all. She exists around Mount Fay, associated with frost, height, and the rare down that she sheds. The ancient weavers knew of her and constructed chambers and a device capable of calling to her, but communing with the Fayforn was never treated as safe. Reaching the summit was itself a test. Even after successfully calling her, the result could be knowledge, a gift, or death. That is an important difference from the transactional religion of the Citadel. The Fayforn does not appear to need pilgrims. She does not build a kingdom. She does not demand prayer. She does not seem interested in explaining herself. The weavers approach her because she possesses something they respect. They do not command her. They ask for her attention. When Hornet eventually reaches the summit and calls the Fayforn, she receives the creature's precious down. The gift becomes part of the Fay-down cloak, allowing Hornet to survive and move through conditions that would otherwise stop her ascent. Later dialogue suggests that giving Hornet something so valuable may represent a choice. The Fayforn has, in some sense, thrown her lot in with Hornet, and by extension, against Grandmother Silk. That small detail completely changes the scale of the conflict. Hornet's struggle is no longer merely a rebel challenging the monarch of Pharloom. Other ancient powers are watching. Some may even be choosing sides. The Fayforn's independence also tells us something about Grandmother Silk's limitations. For all the silk extending across Pharloom, for all the lives twisted into her network, there are still beings beyond her control. Grandmother Silk is enormously powerful. She is not the universe. The distinction becomes even clearer when another traveler reaches the summit, Mr. Mushroom. Mr. Mushroom may be one of the strangest beings in either Hollow Knight game because he appears almost deliberately detached from the normal rules of kingdoms. Kings rise and fall, civilizations collapse. Mr. Mushroom continues traveling. He is called the Master Herald, a figure associated with the ending of ages. His appearance signals that a period of history is approaching some enormous transformation or destruction. He does not cause the change. At least there is no clear evidence that he does. He witnesses it. That might sound less impressive than controlling silk or commanding fire, but consider the scale implied by his behavior. Mr. Mushroom knows that kingdoms are temporary. He moves through them as if their entire histories are simply stops along a much longer journey. Hallownest was one, Pharloom is another. He speaks as someone whose frame of reference extends beyond the lifetime of ordinary societies, and perhaps even beyond the lifetime of some divine beings. There's even a suggestion from the developers that Mr. Mushroom may possess a form of omnipresence, although the exact nature of that statement remains intentionally vague. What matters inside the story is that he survives change. While others fall to dust, he readjusts, and in Silksong he eventually meets the Fayforn. This scene is easy to treat as a strange little encounter, but from a lore perspective, it is extraordinary. Two beings who exist largely outside the political systems of ordinary bugs meet at the highest reaches of Pharloom while an age is ending below them. Mr. Mushroom does not behave like a pilgrim approaching a god. The Fayforn does not behave like a monarch receiving a subject. They communicate almost as peers. For a moment, Silksong allows us to see beyond the kingdom. Pharloom's great religious conflict suddenly feels local. Grandmother Silk may be the most important force in the lives of the bugs trapped beneath the citadel. But beyond that struggle are entities who seem to belong to a much older and wider world. This is one of the reasons calling them outer gods works as a theory, even though the game never uses that exact classification. They are outer not necessarily because they came from outer space or another dimension, but because they exist outside the dominant order. They cannot be fully explained by the citadel. They do not fit comfortably into the hierarchy of Pharloom. And the more of them we discover, the smaller the citadel begins to feel. But even the Fayforn and Mr. Mushroom remain understandable. As living entities, they have bodies, they communicate, they make decisions. There is another force beneath Pharloom that is far more difficult to describe in those terms. The void. The void is where Silksong's theology stops feeling like mythology and begins to feel like cosmology. It is not simply darkness, it is a substance, a force, and under certain conditions almost something resembling a will. Throughout the wider Hollow Knight universe, void exists in fundamental opposition to beings associated with light. This is important because many higher beings express their power through light. Grandmother Silk is pale. The Pale King is associated with light. The radiance is literally a divine light. Void stands against that entire pattern. And unlike ordinary weapons, Void is capable of consuming higher beings with terrifying effectiveness. This makes it perhaps the closest thing in the series to an anti-divine force. The Soul Snare demonstrates this brutally. Hornet believes she is preparing a method to trap Grandmother Silk. What she does not initially understand is what the trap is actually connected to. When activated, the Soul Snare opens a path into the abyss. Void tendrils emerge. They seize Grandmother Silk, and suddenly the pale monarch who has dominated Pharloom for generations is being dragged into something far older, darker, and less interested in her authority than any rebellion has ever been. Grandmother Silk can overpower bugs. She can control Silk across a kingdom. She can survive imprisonment for an age. Against the void, survival becomes an entirely different problem. Her response is revealing. When Lace falls into the void with her, Grandmother Silk protects her. She spins a cocoon around them and continually replaces the silk as the void consumes its exterior. For the first time, the source of Silk is using her power not to expand control, not to reclaim Pharloom, but simply to keep one child alive, and the cost is enormous. The void never stops eating. Grandmother Silk never stops spinning. Her soul is gradually exhausted in the process. This gives us one of Silksong's most powerful images, a pale god hiding inside a tiny sphere of silk, while an ocean of darkness waits outside. The ruler of Pharloom has been reduced to a candle burning at the bottom of the world, and the darkness does not hate her. That might be the most frightening part. The void does not need revenge. It does not care that Grandmother Silk was worshipped. It does not care that she was a monarch. It does not care how many civilizations she transformed. To the void, pale divinity is something that can be consumed. But Grandmother Silk's connection to Pharloom creates another disaster. Her silk extends throughout the kingdom. Once the void begins interacting with her threads, that network becomes a path upward. Blackened silk starts spreading, creatures become possessed, areas collapse. The same system Grandmother Silk used to reach every corner of Pharloom now allows the darkness beneath the world to reach those corners as well. This is the second great inversion of Silk. First, the Citadel used Grandmother Silk's own power to imprison her. Then Grandmother Silk used the Kingdom Silk to haunt its inhabitants. Finally, the Void uses Grandmother Silk's silk to invade Pharloom. Every attempt to control the network simply changes who is pulling the thread, and that may be the central meaning behind Silk as a symbol. Connection gives power. Connection also creates vulnerability. A kingdom where everything is linked can be controlled by whatever reaches the center. This is why the Void is so different from Grandmother Silk. Silk joins things, Void erases them. Silk carries song. Void is associated with silence. Silk preserves relationships between bodies. Void dissolves the difference between bodies entirely. Grandmother Silk's ideal is an eternal union of minds and shells bound through her power. The Void offers another kind of union, one in which there may be nothing left to distinguish one thing from another. This makes Silk and Void almost cosmic opposites. But Silksong complicates even that. Void is not always mindless. The original Hollow Knight already showed that unified void can act with direction. When brought beneath a single will, something normally chaotic becomes capable of purpose. That idea returns with enormous implications. At the end of Hornet's descent, when escape seems impossible, the void does not simply behave as a hungry sea. The night and the siblings appear within it. Hornet catches glimpses of something greater in the night, a form connected to the void's unified potential. And instead of dragging Hornet and Lace downward, they protect them. For perhaps the clearest moment in the story, the same force capable of consuming gods becomes a shield. So is the void evil. Probably not in any simple sense. Uncontrolled, it is catastrophic. Directed, it can oppose powers that would otherwise seem unbeatable. This mirrors almost every other form of power in the series. Silk can create, protect, and connect. Silk can also enslave. Fire can give warmth and life. Fire can also become a religion of self-destruction. The living order surrounding Nyleth can sustain an ecosystem. But even that order eventually fades. The problem is rarely power itself. The problem is what gains control of it. This brings us back to Hornet. Hornet enters Pharloom as an outsider, but biologically and spiritually she is connected to several of the world's deepest systems. Her mother, Hera, was a weaver. Her father was the Pale King, a worm and pale higher being. Hornet therefore carries both weaver ancestry and pale lineage. She enters the kingdom of Grandmother Silk not as an ordinary bug wandering into the domain of a god, but as the descendant of powers that already exist near the boundaries of divinity. Grandmother Silk recognizes her potential. So did the Weavers. Before Hornet's arrival, the Weavers had already explored the possibility of creating or cultivating something that could imitate divine power. Hornet becomes the answer they could never fully manufacture. And one ending reveals exactly how dangerous that potential is. When Hornet binds Grandmother Silk instead of sending her into the void, she takes the mother's power into herself. The transformation is not subtle. Her connection to Silk expands dramatically. Her body changes, additional limbs emerge. The implication is clear. Hornet has crossed a boundary. The hunter who entered Pharloom to escape captivity has become a new Weaver Queen. Depending on how we interpret that transformation, Hornet may effectively become a higher being herself. And suddenly the story forms a cycle. Grandmother Silk once arrived from outside Pharloom's existing order. She transformed its inhabitants. She became its monarch. Generations later, Hornet arrives from outside Pharloom. She defeats the old monarch, she takes her power, and she becomes the new figure at the center of the web. The ending looks victorious, but the symbolism is uncomfortable. Has Hornet liberated Pharloom, or has Pharloom simply acquired another god? That question becomes even more interesting when we remember how divine rule works throughout the series. Gods rarely begin by calling themselves tyrants. Their power creates order, their followers receive gifts, civilization grows around them. Then dependence appears. The god becomes impossible to separate from the kingdom, and eventually the kingdom cannot imagine surviving without the very power that controls it. Hallowness built itself around the Pale King. Pharloom built itself around Silk. Even rebellions against divine rule often continue using divine power. The Weavers imprisoned Grandmother Silk, but still harvested her silk. The Citadel hid the truth but still relied on the source it had buried. Hornet can defeat the mother, yet one possible future has her inheriting the exact power that defined the previous age. This may be why Mr. Mushroom matters so much. To everyone living inside a kingdom, the current struggle feels final. To the Herald, it is simply another age ending. One monarch becomes another, one civilization becomes a ruin. One religion becomes an inscription. Nobody remembers how to read, then something else grows on top of it. Pharloom itself demonstrates this process repeatedly. The Citadel looks eternal when viewed from below. Its architecture dominates the horizon. Pilgrims sacrifice everything to reach it. But beneath that shining symbol are forgotten kingdoms, dead rulers and powers that existed before its foundations. Grandmother Silk appears absolute only if history begins after her victory. Once you look further back, she becomes one chapter in a much longer sequence. That is perhaps the most important lesson of the Old Hearts. They do not merely give Hornet power. They prove that the present order is temporary. There was a Pharloom before Grandmother Silk. Therefore, there can be a Pharloom after Grandmother Silk. This sounds obvious, but within a theocratic kingdom, it is almost revolutionary. The Citadel presents hierarchy as permanence. The land itself remembers otherwise. Nyleth's roots remember. The caves of the Scar remember. The ruins of Karak remember. Verdania remembers. Even when the bugs who inhabited those places are dead, The world retains traces of the rhythms that existed before Silk drowned them out. That word rhythm matters. Silksong constantly connects power with sound. The Citadel uses song. The Weavers use song. Hornet's needle-in interacts with memories, creatures, and mechanisms. The burning bugs chant. The Fayforn sings. Carmelita's voice once united entire tribes. Even the old hearts are described through the idea of rhythms beating throughout the world. Perhaps Pharloom's deepest power is not Silk at all. Perhaps Silk is only one instrument capable of carrying something more fundamental. A rhythm, a pattern, a connection between matter, memory, and will. Grandmother Silk understands one version of that connection and turns it into thread. Nyleth expresses it through roots and living systems. Carmelita expresses it through voice. The Father of the Flame expresses it through ritual fire. The Fayforn answers a musical call. Hornet uses the needle-in to touch things that ordinary speech cannot reach, and the Void stands at the opposite extreme. Silence. If that interpretation is correct, then the title Silksong describes more than Grandmother Silk's power. Silk is connection. Song is will moving through that connection. The kingdom becomes a battlefield over who gets to determine the pattern. That also explains why the Citadel's religion is so obsessed with pilgrimage. Pilgrimage creates movement toward a single point. Bugs from scattered lands leave their homes and climb upward. Different communities are drawn toward the same destination. Physically, socially, and spiritually, the kingdom is being pulled into alignment. Everything points toward the Citadel. Everything points toward the cradle. Everything ultimately points toward Grandmother Silk. Even while she sleeps, the architecture of Pharloom reproduces her basic principle, many threads becoming one. The pilgrims may believe they are climbing towards salvation. From another perspective, they are being woven. This is why the existence of independent powers matters so much. Nyleth does not point toward the Citadel. The Father of the Flame does not point toward the Citadel. The Fayforn does not point toward the Citadel. Mr. Mushroom barely seems to recognize the idea that any one kingdom could be the center of existence, and the void waits beneath everything. Indifferent to the direction pilgrims climb, Pharloom is surrounded by alternatives. The Citadel simply built the loudest story. There's also a fascinating pattern in the way these powers relate to their followers. Grandmother Silk creates descendants and demands devotion. Nyleth sustains life through connection. The Father of the Flame promises transcendence through destruction. The Fayforn offers gifts selectively and without establishing a church. Mr. Mushroom seeks no visible kingdom at all. The Void does not require belief. These are not different names for the same kind of God. They are different answers to the question of what a god can be: a parent, a monarch, an ecosystem, an object of worship, a wild ancient creature, a witness to history, a force of nature, a collective will. The world of Hollow Knight seems deliberately resistant to giving us one theological system that explains all of them, and that may be the point. Ordinary bugs create categories because categories make the world understandable. Higher being, pale being, god, monarch, herald. But the beings themselves do not always respect those distinctions. A mortal heart can challenge divine power. A constructed child can develop her own will. A god can become a prisoner. A prisoner can remain the hidden foundation of a religion. A substance without a face can devour beings worshipped for generations. A traveler who appears almost comedic can outlive kingdoms. The deeper the lore goes, the less useful simple labels become. Even Grandmother Silk refuses to remain a straightforward villain. For most of the story, her actions are horrifying. She manipulates the Weaver's understanding of their own origins. Her influence destroys independence. The haunting turns countless bugs into extensions of her will. Her ideal future would bind the shells and minds of Pharloom into eternal devotion. But when Lace falls with her into the void, Grandmother Silk protects her. That moment does not erase anything she has done. It does reveal something real underneath the role of tyrant. Lace is not simply another tool. Grandmother Silk is willing to exhaust herself keeping her alive. The false mother who once lied to the Weavers about being her divine daughters becomes, in her final moments, a mother desperately protecting a child. Silksong does not excuse her, it complicates her, and that complication may explain why divine beings in this universe are so dangerous. They are not distant moral abstractions. They have desires, they feel attachment, they fear loss, they make decisions based on those emotions while possessing enough power to reshape entire civilizations. A normal bug's obsession might destroy a family. A god's obsession can destroy a kingdom. Grandmother Silk wants unity, the Radiants wanted remembrance and worship. The Pale King wanted Hallowness preserved. None of these desires sound incomprehensible on their own. The horror comes from scale. When a being powerful enough to control thousands of lives decides that its desire is more important than everyone else's freedom, personal emotion becomes cosmic law. That is also why the quieter outer gods of Silksong can feel strangely safer. The Fayforn can kill. Nyleth possesses enormous power. Mr. Mushroom operates according to motives that remain difficult to understand, but they do not seem interested in turning every nearby mind into an extension of themselves. Power becomes most oppressive when it demands universality. Grandmother Silk cannot simply exist alongside Pharloom. Eventually, Pharloom must become hers. Her silk reaches outward. Her children are told that their identity comes from her. Her kingdom is expected to sing for her. Her ideal union leaves no meaningful space outside the web. The void threatens the same loss of individuality from the opposite direction. Grandmother Silk absorbs through connection. Void absorbs through erasure. Hornet's struggle is therefore not merely about defeating one or embracing the other. It is about passing between systems powerful enough to consume her identity without becoming another instrument of them. This is what makes the Sister of the Void ending so significant. Hornet does not conquer the void. She does not become its monarch. She enters it for a specific purpose. She rescues Lace, she accepts help, and she leaves. For once, the resolution is not built around claiming the throne of a cosmic power. It is built around refusing to let another person be taken by one. That may be the most meaningful contrast with the Weaver Queen ending. In one future, Hornet takes power into herself and becomes something greater. In the other, she carries someone else out of the darkness. One ending answers oppression with succession. The other answers it with rest. Neither erases the mystery surrounding Pharloom's gods, but one allows the kingdom to continue without immediately placing another divine monarch at its center. And perhaps that is what Pharloom needs. Not a better god. Space between gods. Space where ordinary lives are allowed to exist without becoming raw material for somebody else's eternal plan. This idea also changes how we should understand the term outer gods. They are not a secret council sitting somewhere beyond Pharloom. There is no evidence that Nyleth, the father of the flame, the Fayforn, Mr. Mushroom, and the Void belong to one faction. They probably do not. Some may not even qualify as gods in the same sense. The useful connection is independence. Each demonstrates that Grandmother Silk is one power among many. Each breaks the illusion that the Citadel's theology describes the whole universe. The Father of the Flame has followers. Grandmother Silk did not create. Nyleth's roots belong to a world older than her kingdom. The Fayforn can make choices beyond her authority. Mr. Mushroom travels across the boundaries of ages. The Void can swallow the pale light that once seemed untouchable. Together, they create a much larger cosmology. And once you see that cosmology, Pharloom starts looking very different. The Citadel is no longer the summit of creation. It is simply the tallest surviving monument of the current age. Grandmother Silk is no longer the mother of the world. She is a conqueror whose victory lasted long enough to become mythology. The old hearts are no longer side stories. They are evidence for an erased history. The strange cults are no longer isolated oddities. They are surviving fragments of spiritual possibilities that the central religion never completely absorbed. And the abyss is no longer merely a dangerous place underground. It is proof that beneath the political conflicts of gods and kingdoms are forces operating on an even deeper level. This is why the geography of Silksong is so effective. Hornet spends much of her journey climbing. The Citadel is above. Holiness appears above. The kingdom teaches everyone to look upward, but some of the most important truths are found by going in the opposite direction, down into ruins, down into memories, down towards civilizations buried beneath the current one, and eventually down into the abyss itself. Pharloom tells its citizens that truth is waiting at the summit. Silksong repeatedly shows Hornet that truth is buried underneath things. Under the Citadel is exploitation. Under the religion is imprisonment. Under the mythology of the Weavers is a lie about their origin. Under the history of Grandmother Silk are older kingdoms. Under Pharloom itself is the Void. Every layer exposes another thing the layer above wanted forgotten. This is why the game's gods feel so ancient even when their exact origins remain mysterious. They are part of an archaeological theology. You do not receive a book explaining the divine hierarchy, you excavate it. A shrine tells you one thing. A corpse tells you another. A forgotten heart contradicts official history. A strange creature on a mountain reveals that the supposedly supreme monarch has a black ocean beneath the world, reveals that even those rivals may exist inside a much larger cycle. And somewhere in the middle of it all is Hornet, trying to decide which inheritance she will accept. She is daughter of Hera, daughter of the Pale King, descendant of weavers, carrier of silk, a pale being with the potential to become something higher. She belongs to multiple histories without fully belonging to any of them. That may be why Hornet succeeds where so many others fail. She can move between systems. The weavers were trapped by their relationship to Grandmother Silk. The Citadel became trapped by the machinery it built around her. The old kingdoms were trapped by their inability to survive her expansion. The burning bugs surrender themselves completely to their father. Even Grandmother Silk becomes trapped by the silk that connects her to Pharloom. Hornet's greatest strength is movement. She enters, she learns, she takes what she needs, and depending on the ending, she can leave. Her needle and thread visually resemble the power dominating Pharloom, but Hornet's style of using silk is fundamentally different. Grandmother Silk uses thread to bind others. Hornet uses thread to move herself. That distinction may contain the entire philosophy of Silksong. Connection does not have to mean captivity. Power does not have to mean domination. Inheritance does not have to mean repetition. A thread can be a leash. It can also be a line that carries you somewhere new. And perhaps that is why the oldest powers of Pharloom are willing to help Hornet. The Fayforn grants her down. The old hearts lend their fading strength. Memories open to her. Even Grandmother Silk eventually gives Hornet the silk needed to escape the abyss with lace. At the end of the age, power begins moving away from the structures that once hoarded it. The old world gives pieces of itself to someone capable of carrying them forward. Mr. Mushroom arrives because he recognizes what is happening. An age is not simply ending because one ruler dies. An age ends when the assumptions holding a world together stop being true. For generations, Pharloom's central assumption was that everything eventually belonged to Silk. Then Hornet arrives. The old powers awaken in memory. The Fayforn chooses, the mother falls, the void rises. The hidden history of the kingdom becomes impossible to ignore, and the web begins to break. What comes afterward remains uncertain. That uncertainty is appropriate. The Hollow Knight universe has never promised permanent victories. Hallownest believed it had created eternity. It became a tomb. Pharloom's citadel reached toward permanence. It became a cage. Any new order claiming to last forever would probably repeat the same mistake. Maybe that is what Mr. Mushroom understands better than kings and gods, ages, not because every civilization fails in exactly the same way, but because change is stronger than any attempt to freeze history. Roots grow through ruins, new creatures inhabit abandoned halls, names lose their meaning, religions become archaeology. Even gods become memories, and something else always waits beyond them. That is the real lore of Silksong's outer gods. Not a hidden pantheon, not a list of secret final bosses, a reminder that the world is much older than the kingdom trying to explain it. Grandmother Silk is powerful, but she did not create Pharloom. Nyleth remembers a living order older than the Citadel. The old hearts remember rulers who once believed their own ages would endure. The Father of the Flame reveals a faith that seeks salvation outside Silk. The Fayforn watches from heights the Pale Monarch cannot completely command. Mr. Mushroom walks through history as kingdoms fall behind him, and the void waits beneath them all, capable of swallowing even those called higher. Every one of these powers destroys the same illusion. There is no final center. There is only the power that happens to dominate the current age. And this may be the darkest possibility Silksong leaves us with. Perhaps there are many more. Pharloom and Hallownest are kingdoms separated by distance and history, yet both contain higher beings, ancient powers, strange substances, forgotten religions and forces, capable of transforming entire populations. If two ruined kingdoms contain this much divinity, what exists beyond them? How many lands were shaped by beings whose names we will never hear? How many gods rose, ruled, and vanished before either kingdom existed? How many creatures like the Fayforn inhabit mountains nobody has climbed? How many heralds wander from civilization to civilization? How many abysses lie beneath worlds that believe themselves eternal? The map suddenly feels very small, and maybe that is intentional. Hollow Knight began by making Hallownest feel like the entire universe. Then its boundaries became visible. Silksong expands those boundaries again. Pharloom introduces another kingdom with its own ancient history and its own divine catastrophe. Yet Mr. Mushroom's journey reminds us that even this new world is only another destination. The gods we meet are enormous from the perspective of a bug, from the perspective of history. They may be temporary. From the perspective of whatever exists beyond these kingdoms, they may be local spirits fighting over tiny pieces of a much greater world. That possibility makes the title Outer Gods especially fitting, because the most frightening thing about the gods outside Pharloom's official religion is not how powerful they are. It is what their existence implies. Grandmother Silk was never alone. The Citadel was never the center. Pharloom was never the whole story. There were powers before Silk. There are powers beyond Silk. And after the last song of the Citadel fades, after its bells stop ringing and its threads finally decay, something will